If you have your Bibles with you, and I hope you do, or you have them as I do in various versions on my iPhone, turn to Revelation chapter 3. Now, when you tell an Adventist congregation you want to turn to Revelation 3, you watch them all brace themselves and tense, because everyone's sure they know what's coming. The message to Laodicea. Surprise. We're not looking at the message to Laodicea. We're going to the message to the church in Philadelphia, Revelation 3 and verse 10. Follow with me, please. Because you have kept my word of patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. I am coming soon. Hold fast to what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. If you conquer, I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God. You will never go out of it. I will write on you the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem that comes down from God out of heaven, and my own new name. If you had grown up at a particular time in the 1960s, you would have been familiar with a song which has lingered in the cultural memory for a while. It was a song that actually came from a Broadway hit musical. The musical, The Man of La Mancha. The story of the fabled Spanish knight Don Quixote. The song, however, outlived the story. The song was called The Impossible Dream. Remnants of it can still be found. You can always check Wikipedia if you look for the lyrics. To dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe, to bear with unbearable sorrow, to run where the brave dare not go, to right the unrightable wrong, to love pure and chaste from afar, to try when your arms are too weary, to reach the unreachable star. This is my quest, to follow that star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far, to try for the right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. Well, that was music that stirred a 10-year-old soul. My brothers and I, never really a trio, would nonetheless belt that song out at the top of our lungs as we drove in the old Ford station wagon across the country. And my parents, proving their patience, listened to it. I got vaguely familiar with the storyline of Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote through high school and early in college, though I do confess, as a literature major, I never actually read all of Don Quixote. That's something literature majors don't usually confess, so understand the gravity of this moment. But I did become familiar with the musical play which was current at the time and whose song I have just quoted from. And in the musical version of the story of Don Quixote, as always happens in Broadway songs, liberties are taken with the storyline. And for the purposes of what I'm going to share, we're going to use the version that Broadway used. In the Broadway musical, an errant knight, an elderly man by the name of Don Quixote, on a dilapidated farm in Spain, suddenly becomes gripped with the idea that it is his duty, his responsibility, his chivalric obligation to go and set the world right. He must rescue damsels, he must destroy dragons, he must honor purity in all its forms. Don Quixote is, as my kids might say, losing it. Or so those closest to him think. He's delusional, they say. At his age, How is he supposed to go and set things right in this tawdry world? He's old. He has no resources. He has literally one servant left who stays not for the wages, but out of loyalty to the old man, a rotund little fellow named Sancho Panza, who basically stays as a kind of caregiver masquerading as a servant. When Don Quixote announces his vision to go out as a knight, set the world right, rescue damsels, destroy dragons, Sancho Panza protests the obvious delusional qualities of this dream. Sir, he says, you are old. You have no resources. I have a great war horse down in the pasture. And Sancho Panza looks because all there is a sway-backed old farm horse down there. But Don Quixote sees in it a great war horse which he will sit astride as he goes on his deeds. So he insists, get me my war horse. And to humor the old man, hoping that this episode will not last long, Sancho Panza retrieves the sway-backed farm horse, helps the old man in his rusty armor aboard the horse, and then Don Quixote announces, we are off on our quest. Sancho Panza assumes that this quest will end at the edge of the property, but it doesn't. In fact, the old man is intent on a lengthy journey, and nothing that Sancho Panza can do will stop him. Late in the afternoon of their first day away from the old dilapidated estate, they come over the crest of a hill and they look down into the valley, and there in the bottom of the valley at a crossroads is a rather disreputable institution which in some cultures of the world is known as a roadhouse. Cross that with bordello, cross that with bar, well, you begin to get the picture. It is not the kind of place where purity is likely established, and Sancho Panza, sensing what's coming, tries to steer the old man away down an alternate route. But the old man says, I see down in the valley a great estate, the manor of a great lord. Sancho Panza is looking and seeing nothing like that. Go, he says, and fetch for me the lord of this great manor. Tell him that he must come and knight me as I begin my quest. Sancho Panza looks nervously around, trundles down the hill, and opens the door. It is a scene of chaos, morally and in every way. And eventually he finds the lord of this great estate. In fact, the man who's cooking food passes for food there. He tries to explain his errand. Sir, he says, please, I have this delusional old man on top of the hill. It will go better for all of us if we just humor him. Please come with me and knight him in the proper fashion. So soon enough, the lord of the great estate, who's actually a disreputable owner of a bordello, comes trudging up the hill, and Don Quixote, seeing him, dismounts from his horse, and with all the elegance he can muster in his rusty armor, kneels to accept his knighthood. The lord of the great estate taps him on the shoulders with a giant wooden spoon he's been carrying from stirring the stew. Well, Sancho Panza has devoutly hoped this will be the end of the scene and the end of the quest, but it does not end there. In fact, the old man says, well, I must now go down and enter this great estate. And both the innkeeper and Sancho Panza both of them are now afraid. But he will not be deterred. He descends the hill, he opens the door, and it is still the scene of chaos that Sancho Panza had first viewed. But Don Quixote glides into the room, and he sees the barmaid on the other side of the room. And he begins to sing to her in the music. He addresses her as the beautiful and virtuous lady Dulcinea. And in the musical, he sings this lovely romantic song to the purity and the virtue of Dulcinea. All the men at the bar, mostly mule keepers, begin laughing when they figure out that he is singing to her. Her name is not Dulcinea, her name is Aldonza. And when she finally begins to understand that this old delusional man is singing to her, why, she begins to be terribly embarrassed, and she interrupts his virtuous song and says, "No, that's not who I am." And she sings a song of her own about having been born in a ditch and having been used and abused by dozens of men throughout her life. She is not Dulcinea, the beautiful, virtuous woman. She is Aldonza, the barmaid. But Don Quixote will have none of it. He insists that she is a virtuous lady, and he approaches her and requests a token of her favor. Would she please give him a scarf he can wear upon his rusty armor as he goes on his quest to remember the purity and the virtue of this woman who inspires him so much? More to end the scene, she rips off a piece of her apron, and he brings it to his lips and tucks it carefully between the chinks of his armor. Well, this is the way the story unfolds. Scene to scene, Don Quixote imagines purity and beauty and virtue where all there is tawdriness and sin and wretchedness. In the original novel by Cervantes, we get the expression that has come into English called tilting at windmills. For when Don Quixote first encounters a windmill, he assumes it is one of the mythic dragons that he is out to conquer. And so he spurs his old sway-backed farm horse and gets it to lumber along and lowers his wooden lance and charges the windmill with predictable results. Sancho Panza picks up the bruised and broken old man, and yet Don Quixote will not quit. He is out to set the world right. As the musical concludes, after many such interludes, Don Quixote is now back at his own estate. And for a change, he is in his right mind. He no longer believes it is his job to set the world right. He has come to his senses. The world is ugly. The world is damaged. The world is broken. And he is despairing. He is in bed and he is dying. Sancho Panza does what he can to comfort the old man. And then, in the alchemy known only to Broadway, one by one, each of the characters whom he has met in his quest appear at his bedside. The lord of the great estate, the pure and virtuous woman who wasn't. Each of them appears at his bedside, and they beg him. They beg him, never change what you thought we were. Never change what you thought we were, for that is what we have become. The disreputable innkeeper has become an honest businessman. Oh, not yet the lord of a great manor, but he is ethical now, and he only employs people who honor his ethics. Aldonza, she is not yet the woman of Don Quixote's dream, but she has left that life. She is making good choices. Each of them begs him, never change what you thought we were, for that is what we have become. The power of a new name. When I heard that story, I realized I already knew it, but in a different way. The power of a new name. It was my first day of seminary in 1980 at Andrews University, and I literally knew only 2 other students on the entire campus. I went to class. It was one of these endless orientation experiences, icebreakers, the things they want to do to get you to know other students at a time when you're desperately trying to get settled. And so they pitched us in to hear some lectures about what life at the seminary would be like, and I happened to sit beside a sort of cheerful-looking fellow who reached out, put his hand out, and said, "Hello, friend." Friend? I'm sorry, I'm from New England. And New England, like some places in Old England, does not wear its heart on its sleeve. You can live beside someone for 30 years in New England and they are not yet your friend. Your family may have lived in this town for 150 years and they may not speak well of the people who live next door. You never use the term friend casually in my culture. But this cheerful guy from the other side of the United States reached out his hand and said, "Hello, friend." And I reached out and shook his hand and thought I made a note that I would sit with someone else at the next session. But he seemed to follow me around when we left for lunch and split to come back in an hour. "See you later, friend," he said. Friend, he used the term again. I wasn't his friend. I didn't even know him. How could he use that term? When we came back from lunch, "Hello, friend," he said. Every time we arrived or parted for 3 days, he called me friend. And so, over the next 6 months, that is what I became. His friend. He persisted in calling me by a name I did not deserve, and so that is what I became. 1 year later, I stood at the front of a church to pledge my love to the woman who is still my wife, 41 years later, almost 42. And standing beside me was that guy. He was one of the groomsmen at our wedding. I remember a sense of astonishment. Well, everyone is a little bit astonished at their wedding, but I remembered a sense of astonishment that this woman, whom I loved and whom I love, would call me by a name I did not yet deserve. She called me husband in front of 400 witnesses. I had no experience being a husband, and there were several old girlfriends out there who doubted I would be very good at it. It was completely an act of faith on Debbie's part. Husband, she said, in front of witnesses, and, well, that's what I became. Well, actually, that is what I am still becoming. 42 years later, I am still becoming her husband. Exactly 1 year later, we arrived on Christmas morning, a Sabbath, at our first district churches. The conference had promised that one of the conference officers would drive the hour down to introduce us in our churches on our first Sabbath, but it was Christmas and they had family and they didn't come, and so we introduced ourselves. 6 inches of fresh snow in New England that morning. I remember walking up through the snow toward the little white church perched on the hill like a classic scene out of some postcard. It was literally a church built on a rock, and the souls of the members were just about as flexible. Tough, cranky Yankees. The The kind of people, and I'm not making this up, that when the benediction was said and we were exiting the platform, the deacon reached over and turned the heat off in one smooth move so that we would waste no heat as we exited the building. That morning, as I walked up through the snow toward the front door, full of radiance and life, my first parish, I met an elderly gentleman who walked out in the snow, reached out his hand and said, "Hello," he said, "I'm the old kingpin around here. This church started in my living room 40 years ago. Just thought you'd like to know." I was glad for the information. I walked in and I stood there and looked at 35 souls looking back at me. And they did something utterly amazing. They called me pastor. Now you have to know that in my vocabulary, pastor is one of the most sacred words in the English language. And they called me pastor. I had never been their pastor. It was completely an act of faith on their part. I had done nothing to deserve the term, and yet they called me pastor. And so, over the next 3 remarkable years, that is what I became, their pastor. I had grown up in large collegiate churches with big pipe organs and choirs every Sabbath, and now I was in a place where the little electric organ that didn't get heat all week might not warm up enough to play on Sabbath morning. And if the only person who could play it arrived. There wasn't even running water in the church, no telephone. Heat only for 2 hours and 29 minutes every Sabbath morning. But I became their pastor. Their lives were different than mine. They drove the snow plows on the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. They worked in the nursing homes and the hospitals and the emergency rooms. They cared for the elderly. I began to learn what it means to identify with a group of people whose story was different than my own. And by the grace of God and by the persistence of the name they called me, that is what I became, their pastor. I've watched many of you smiling. You see, you know this story too, don't you? Someone called you by a name you did not yet deserve. Someone called you faithful when you were not yet faithful, and so that is what you became. Someone called you honest when you were still struggling to keep a clean set of books, but that is what you became. Someone called you friend when you had been gossiping behind their back. And by the grace of God, you became their friend. And Jesus called you disciple, follower, before you had ever earned the name. And so, by the grace of Jesus, that is what you are becoming. I will write on you my own new name. This is one of those stories that never ends. Because before this day is over, you will have the opportunity to call someone by a better name than they deserve. You will have the chance yet today to call someone by a name they have not yet earned, for that is the essence of grace. Let me invite you. Let me urge you. Let me plead with you. Just as Jesus has called you by a name you do not deserve, extend the grace to call others by a name they do not yet deserve. Pray with me now. Lord Jesus, we are reminded again and again of your faith in what we can become by the power of your new name in our lives. We ask that as we learn to live in the fullness of that name, you will teach us to be gracious with those around us who are also on the journey. We ask these things because we believe in you and in your gospel. In your powerful name, amen.